They said the creek was too deep. They said she'd drown in the current, disappear beneath the weight of their lies. But Clara James didn't come to be saved. She came to save everything they tried to break. When sabotage threatened to freeze an entire mountain camp, she crossed that icy water alone, boots soaked, name on the line. She didn't fight with noise. She fought with precision, patience, and the quiet power of being right. This isn't just survival. This is the story of a woman who stayed and made them remember her forever. The old mule stopped dead at the creek's edge, hooves planted firm, chest heaving, ears pinned back like something weighted on the other side that only she could sense. The reins pulled taut in Clara James's gloved hands, but the animal wouldn't budge, not with coaxing, not with threats, not with the kind voice Clara used when she'd tried everything else and had nothing left but hope. The stream wasn't deep. It moved fast, sure, but clear. Cold mountain water over smooth rock, barely high enough to wet a boot. The wooden slats of the logging camp's bridge had washed out last week in a flash flood, and now all that remained was the shallow crossing and a handful of rails reaching toward nothing. Behind her, the wagon creaked under its load, spare parts, tools, the final sack of meal from town. She'd made the ride solo like she always did now. There was no one else, no one who knew the generator like she did, no one who understood the brittle stubbornness of this mule, this land, this woman. All of them had earned it. "Come on, girl," Clara said, voice low. "You know I wouldn't ask if I didn't have to." The mule blinked, snorted, and shook her head. Clara sighed, looked up at the sky, already gray. They didn't have time for stalling. The wind shifted just as Clara stepped down from the wagon, boots crunching the frost-bitten grass near the creek. The old mule kept its hooves planted, refusing even the slightest forward movement, breathing heavy with that deep, immovable knowing some creatures were born with. Clara didn't blame her. They'd seen too many storms between them to pretend like this one would pass easy. She walked to the mule's side, ran a hand along its shoulder, and whispered, "It's just water. But you feel something else, don't you?" The mule blinked slowly. Clara stood still for a beat longer, then stepped into the creek herself. Icy water soaked through her boots in seconds. She waded carefully, feeling for the slick stone beneath the surface. The current tugged, impatient but not wild, and she kept her footing until she reached the far side. There she turned, knee-deep, and met the mule's eyes. "You're right," she said quietly, "but we still have to go." She walked back, reached for the harness. This time, the mule followed, not fast, but sure. Together they crossed. By the time they crested the hill and the roofs of the logging camp came into view, the sun had dipped low behind the trees. Smoke curled from only one chimney. That wasn't right, not at this hour. Clara narrowed her eyes. No sound of saws, no shout from the yard, just the thin whistle of wind through the clearing. The camp was too still. She pulled the wagon into the main yard and found the foreman pacing near the mess hall, jaw tight, eyes flicking to her like he didn't want to admit he'd been waiting. "What is it?" Clara asked, climbing down. "It's the generator," he said. "Went dead this morning. Took the boiler offline with it. No heat, no power. No one's been able to get it started again." "And the backup?" "Didn't engage. Something's jammed. We're running out of light." Clara didn't respond, just grabbed her satchel and headed for the engine shed. It was cold inside. Quiet. Too quiet. She flipped the main switch. Dead. The air stung her fingers as she pulled off her gloves and ran them along the control panel, feeling for warmth, vibration, anything. Nothing. Then she opened the housing. And there it was. The fuse line was shredded clean through. Not wear, not time. Sabotage. Clara froze, then moved. She laid out her tools on the workbench with calm hands, heart pounding low and even. Not because she was afraid, because she had seen this before. Not this exact wound, but the pattern. They always blamed her when things went wrong, and someone had planned for her to be the last to touch the generator before it failed. That way, when the lights went out, so would her name. Again, but this time she was ready. She replaced the fuse with a spare she always carried, then rerouted the wiring through a bypass she'd installed months ago, quietly, without permission, because she knew no one else would think to prepare. When she threw the switch, the lights returned all at once. A hum rose from the boiler, the shed warmed, and somewhere across camp someone cursed under their breath. Clara didn't smile. She didn't need to. She walked straight to the foreman's cabin, her boots leaving damp marks on the wood floor, and said, "You've got someone here who doesn't want me fixing what's broken." He looked up slowly. She tossed the frayed fuse on his desk. "I'll find out who it is," she said. "And when I do, don't ask me to be quiet about it." Outside, the camp stirred. Lights flickered on in the bunkhouses. Voices returned. The cold receded just enough. And the woman they once doubted, once blamed, once tried to write off, she had done it again. She had saved them. Not with fire, with precision, with proof. With the kind of steady, quiet truth no one could sabotage. Not anymore. Not now that they knew who really kept the heat burning. Not now that Clara James had crossed the creek and come back with fire. By morning, the camp was warm again, not just from the restored heat pouring through the boiler lines, but from the hush of understanding that followed Clara James wherever she walked now. The saw crews nodded as she passed, their gazes longer, more deliberate, not questioning, but seeing. She hadn't slept, didn't need to. After fixing the generator, she'd walk the perimeter with a lantern in hand, checking every line, every joint, every post that might have been tampered with. Someone had tried to bring her down again. They'd underestimated her. Again. They always did, but not for much longer. She stood outside the mess hall, steam curling from a mug between her palms, watching the camp move in the early light. The mule, her mule, rested in the shade beside the storage barn, eyes half-lidded, tail swishing lazily. Like nothing had ever been wrong, like she'd known Clara would make it through. The foreman approached, hat in hand. "We found the broken lock on the storage shed," he said, "and your spare fuse key missing. One of the new boys, gone before sunrise." Clara didn't move. "So he thought if the lights stayed off, I'd be the one blamed." "Reckon he did." She sipped her tea. "He picked the wrong woman." The foreman nodded slowly. "Nobody's arguing that anymore." The silence that followed said more than any apology could. Clara walked back to the engine shed, wiped the soot from the floor, and updated the logbook with every detail. What had failed? Why, how she fixed it. She wrote plainly. She always did. That way, no one could twist her words. No one could say they hadn't seen. Later that day, a younger worker approached her with a question about the pulley calibration. She showed him how to check the tension, how to hear the slight difference in the line's hum when it was tuned just right. He asked, "How do you know all this?" She answered without looking up, "Because I've had to." By afternoon, the story had spread beyond Silver Pine. A writer brought word from the southern logging station. They'd heard what happened. Heard that someone had tried to sabotage the woman who had saved half the valley from a blackout last winter. The woman who'd crossed a half-flooded creek with a wagon full of parts and no one but a mule and her own name to rely on. They weren't asking if she'd failed. They were asking when she could come train their teams. She didn't answer right away. She walked back to the creek instead, to the place the mule had stopped, to the rocks that had shifted beneath her feet that night. The water ran clearer now, gentler. It always did after a storm. She crouched, dipped her fingers into the current, and closed her eyes. There had been a time when she'd have crossed rivers just to be believed. Now she crossed them because she knew what waited on the other side. Not approval. Proof. She stood slowly, looked back at the trail. She would go south. but she would go on her terms because Clara James wasn't a lesson anymore. She was the one who rewrote the ending, and no man's sabotage could stop the truth she carried. Not when her boots were already planted. In the soil of every fire she'd refused to leave. Not when the camp itself ran on her hands and her name, and the current she no longer feared crossing. By evening, the wind picked up, dry and restless, slipping through the trees with a sound that used to make Clara brace. Not anymore. Now she listened to it like a message she already understood. The generator purred behind her, smooth and even, its rhythm like a second heartbeat to the camp. Smoke rose from chimneys, the saw house rumbled to life again, and supper clattered in the mess hall with the kind of noise that meant people were safe, warm, working. Clara stood outside the engine shed, wiping her hands on a rag, watching the mule chew contentedly in the paddock. Her shoulders ached, but in the good way, the earned way, the kind of ache that told her she'd held something heavy and didn't drop it. Callum approached quietly. He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. He carried a folded telegram in one hand. "Headquarters knows," he said simply. "They want your side of it before they write it up." Clara didn't move. "What are they planning to say?" "That you stopped a failure." She gave a dry laugh. "That's all?" Callum hesitated. "They're asking if you'll speak at the next regional assembly." Clara turned toward him slowly, eyes steady. "They want a woman on the stage because they know they can't take credit for what I fixed." "They're asking," he said again. She nodded once. "Then I'll answer, but I won't flatter them." And they both knew she wouldn't. When the moon rose, Clara sat by the fire outside her cabin. The mule settled nearby, the shed's windows glowing behind her like a cathedral built of steel and second chances. She opened her old logbook, the same one they'd ignored when they'd first accused her, and flipped to a fresh page. She wrote, "Let the record show. They tried to name me a liability. I answered with light. They tried to cast me out. I built something they couldn't replace. They tried to shame me. I stayed." Then she closed the book, not out of anger, out of peace. Across camp, a girl barely 20, new this season, passed by and paused at the edge of the light. "Miss James?" Clara looked up. I heard what happened, what you did." Clara didn't speak. The girl stepped closer. "My mother told me your story before I came. She said you saved a camp that tried to erase you." Clara blinked once. "I didn't save it. I held it accountable." The girl swallowed. "I want to do what you do, one day." Clara gestured to the chair beside her. "Start by sitting still when they expect you to run," she said. "Then keep building, even when no one's watching." The girl sat, and for a long time they listened to the wind, not afraid, not waiting, just still. The mule huffed, the engine hummed, and the night held its breath. For the woman who crossed the creek proved the lie and lit the whole mountain with the truth. No one could silence again. By midnight, the camp was asleep, except for Clara. She sat on the porch, feet planted, hands quiet in her lap. The lantern beside her glowed low, just enough to cast a soft halo on the railing, on the snow-worn boots by the door, on the corner of the logbook still tucked under her arm. The mule shifted in her stall, a rustle of straw and steady breath. The wind had calmed. The machines were at rest. And Clara? She wasn't tired. She was full of silence, of knowing, of a kind of earned stillness no one had given her. She'd carved it herself, moment by moment, from every doubt they tried to bury her in. Out across the darkened yard, the generator thrummed on. It didn't need her now, not tonight. But it ran because of her, because she'd been the one to walk into the storm, the sabotage, the silence, and not blink. They had accused her once. Now they built policies around her name. And still, she hadn't left, because this place, these machines, these people, even the ones who once turned their backs, were stronger now. Not just because she fixed what was broken, but because she taught them to listen, to question, to stay. She stood. The lantern flame flickered as she opened the cabin door. Before stepping inside, she looked once more across the camp, not for reassurance, but to remind herself this was hers, not by ownership, by presence, by resilience, by truth. The old mule exhaled softly behind her. Clara smiled, just barely, then said, as if to the night itself, "They'll tell stories about what I repaired, but the real story is that I never needed their permission to begin." And with that, she closed the door behind her. Lights on, engine steady, name remembered, legacy written, in bolts, in breath, and the quiet, unshakable fact that Clara James stayed. By morning, frost had rimmed the windows, not thick, just enough to remind the camp that the mountains still ruled the rhythm. The fire in Clara's stove crackled low, and the light outside crept over the pines in soft gold bands. Another day, another shift, another list of things to check, to tighten, to keep running. She pulled on her boots, still streaked with creek mud from days before, tied them slow, deliberate, no rush. Everything important had already been salvaged, her name, her voice, her place. What remained now was the building, the tending, the passing on. When she stepped outside, the air met her like an old friend. Tess stood by the generator, clipboard in hand, scanning the gauges the way Clara had taught her. She didn't call out when she saw Clara, just gave a small nod, and Clara returned it. The torch had been passed, and both of them knew it without ceremony. The mule, always near, flicked her ears and stamped once. Ready. Clara crossed the yard with a steady gait. Every board beneath her boots, every cable overhead, every knot in every timber. They all knew her steps by now. By midday, the crew gathered around the freight wagon. A new load of steel parts, sent up from the southern depot, awaited cataloging. The foreman held a clipboard and called for help, and 3 men moved at once. Clara didn't speak. She just picked up the heaviest box and hauled it into the shed. The foreman paused, then smiled. In the ledger, he added her initials in the margin beside every major delivery. It was understood now. Nothing came through Silverpine that didn't run through Clara's hands. That afternoon, while walking the ridge trail above camp, Clara found herself at the same creek where it had all nearly come undone. The water ran smooth now, low and easy. She stood on the same rock she'd stood on months ago, reins in hand, soaked to the knees. She thought of the mule, of the crossing, of the lie, and how none of it had defined her. What defined her were the systems still humming, the roofs still holding, the girls still walking into sheds without lowering their voices. Clara crouched and dipped her hand into the creek, cold, real, alive, just like her. She stayed there a moment longer. Then she stood, turned back toward the trail, and said aloud, quietly, clearly, "This was never about what they took from me. It was about what I built after." And with that, Clara Bell walked back toward the camp that now bore the shape of her staying. Step by step, story by story, and truth by truth, never erased, only earned. By dusk, the light slid long over the rooftops. It caught on the edges of the saw house, on the tips of the pine needles, on the curve of the iron valve Clara had replaced just that morning. The camp settled into its evening rhythm, boots scraping clean, stove doors clanging shut, laughter rising low from the mess hall. Clara stood in the doorway of the engine shed, arms crossed, watching the sky go from gold to bruised purple. This was the hour she loved best. Not because it was quiet, but because it was honest. The work was done, the heat was holding, and everything that still stood had survived another day. She walked the edge of the clearing, passing the old rose bush near the shed. It was withering now, petals fallen, leaves curled in, but the roots held. That was the truth of it. Beauty faded. What endured was what had learned to dig in, to stay. The mule blinked at her from the far fence, tail flicking once in acknowledgment. Clara tipped her chin. As she reached her cabin, Tess was waiting. "Letter came," she said. "From the girl at North Pass, the one you trained." Clara took it, opened it slow. The paper was creased and smudged with graphite. A short note. "They said it wasn't my place. I told them, 'Clara, cross the creek. I can fix the damn pump.'" Clara smiled, folded the letter, tucked it into the wooden box on her shelf, the one filled with quiet proofs, with names she'd never forget. Tess lingered at the door. "They listen to her now?" Clara nodded. "They will." That night the camp slept beneath a sharp, starlit sky, and in the shed the gauges held steady. The lines were warm. The ledger was up to date. Her name stamped at the top. Not because she asked for it, but because they finally understood. Clara James hadn't come to be believed. She came to make sure no one else had to fight, just to be right. And she'd done it, with boots in the mud, with fire in her chest, and a truth that carried, long past the creek, through every camp she touched, and still she stayed. By midnight the sky was ink, no wind, no sound, just the distant creak of wood cooling, the slow breath of a camp that had come through another season because someone had refused to walk away when it would have been easier. Clara sat on the edge of her bunk, boots unlaced, logbook open across her knees. The fire in the stove burned low. Her hands were clean. The day's notes were already written. New tension in the secondary line, Tess's adjustments to the regulator, one shipment delayed. Nothing urgent, nothing broken, just the kind of small details that kept things running without notice. She liked it that way. The mule shifted in the stall just outside, restless but calm, always aware, always listening. Clara leaned back, let the silence stretch. She wasn't waiting for anything. Not praise, not permission, not even rest. She was here because she chose to be, because everything she'd built now ran without her voice raised, without her having to prove it again and again, because the machines remembered, the systems remembered, the people remembered. She closed the logbook, set it on the table beside the stack of letters she still hadn't answered. She'd get to them. One at a time. She always did. Before she turned in, she stepped outside once more. The night smelled like pine and iron and cooling earth. The same creek she had crossed months ago, ankle-deep, freezing, impossible, glinted now in the dark like a thread of silver. She stood at its edge, not to relive the crossing, but to honor it. The lie that had started it all no longer mattered. What mattered was what came after. Clara bent down, touched the surface of the water with 2 fingers, and whispered, not to the creek, but to herself. "They'll remember me for what I fixed." She paused. "But I'll remember that I stayed." And with that she stood, turned, and walked back toward the only thing she'd ever really needed, a place that worked. Because she never stopped working, a camp that held. Because she held it together, a name that meant what it always should have. Clara James, the woman who crossed the creek, rewrote the ending, and stayed. By dawn the fog rolled in low and slow, hugging the ground like breath. The first bird calls hadn't yet broken the silence, and the camp sat still beneath the gray. But inside the shed, the boiler ticked steadily, the pipes warm, the gauges balanced, everything running just as Clara James had left it the night before. She was already up, coffee in hand, standing by the generator's main panel, scanning it with the same quiet focus she had from the beginning. There was no emergency, no breakdown. She just liked to see it in the light, proof that it still held, that she still did. Behind her, Tess entered without knocking. "It held," she said, rubbing her arms against the cold. Clara nodded. "Of course it did." They didn't speak for a while, just listened to the hum. Finally, Tess asked, "Do you ever think about the beginning? The day they blamed you?" Clara sipped her coffee, watching steam rise from the mug. "Sometimes," she said, "but not the part where they turned on me." "No?" She shook her head. "I remember the fuse, the way the light came back when I fixed it. I remember standing there knowing they didn't deserve the repair, but the camp did." Tess sat down on the bench. "You didn't stay to change their minds, did you?" Clara looked out the shed's wide open doors, toward the sun just starting to glow behind the trees. "No," she said, "I stayed so the next woman wouldn't have to explain herself first." That afternoon, they installed the final piece of the new line, a system Clara had designed for expansion. She didn't take the credit out loud, but her initials were carved into the bracket anyway. CJ, small and neat, just above the weld. It was the kind of mark you could miss, unless you knew where to look. That night the camp lit lanterns in the trees. No celebration, just light. A quiet thing, a mark of passing seasons, of systems that still ran, of women who still stood. Clara walked the edge of it, one hand on the mule's reins, boots crunching softly over gravel and pine needles. She'd gotten a letter that morning. Another offer, another title, another reason to leave. She'd folded it once and set it on the stove to keep the kettle company. She wasn't going anywhere. She'd already arrived. As the stars came out, she stood by the creek one last time, where the old bridge had once groaned, and the water still moved fast, but not high. She whispered, "They said I'd slow things down." She smiled. "I sped everything up." And behind her, the camp ran, on light, on truth, on the name they could never erase. Clara James, still here, still steady, still standing. By the time the sun crested the ridge, the camp was already humming, not with urgency, but with certainty. The kind that settles when nothing is falling apart, when the tools are where they should be, when the people know what they're doing and why. Clara walked the yard with her gloves tucked in her belt, sleeves rolled, the day's checklist already in her head. She paused by the rose bush. The last bloom had withered 2 days ago. Petals curled in on themselves, stem bowed, but the roots were strong. She knew what looked dead wasn't finished. It was just resting, preparing to come back stronger when the time was right. Like her. A group of newer hires passed, all of them nodding as they went. One murmured, "Morning, Miss James," like a reflex. She didn't nod back. She just kept walking. She'd already done the work of being noticed. Now she was part of the structure, like the boiler, like the ridge, like the sky. Inside the shed, she checked the main line pressure, logged a clean report, and left Tess in charge of the inspections. At lunch, the foreman approached with a bundle under his arm. "Something for the shed," he said, a little sheepish. Clara raised a brow, unwrapped the cloth. It was a hand-carved plaque. James Engine Shed. She crossed the creek, then she made it run. Clara stared at it for a long moment. Not touched, not overwhelmed, just steady. "Where do you want it?" he asked. She pointed to the beam above the door. "There." They hung it before supper. By nightfall, the stars came out over a camp that had once tried to erase her and now carried her name like a promise. Clara stood at the edge of the creek one last time that night, the water whispering low and fast beneath the moon. "I stayed," she said softly, then added like an oath, "and I made it better." Behind her, the plaque caught the light. The hum of the generator didn't stop, and neither did she. By midnight, Silver Pine slept. The lanterns were out. The sawhouse was quiet. Snowmelt trickled down from the high ridge in a whisper, winding past the outer cabins and pooling along the creek where Clara James had once stood, soaked and blamed, her name hanging heavy in the mouths of people who didn't yet deserve it. Now they spoke it like a compass. She sat outside the shed, wrapped in her coat, mug warm between her palms. The new plaque above the doorway caught the starlight in soft glints. It didn't shine. It didn't have to. It marked a truth that no longer needed to be defended. Tess had gone to bed hours earlier. So had the rest of the crew. But Clara stayed, the way she always had, not watching over them, just watching. Because the camp no longer needed protecting. It was held now by her systems, by her teaching, by her legacy. She thought about the letter waiting inside, another invitation to speak, another panel, another room full of people who hadn't believed her the first time but were ready to quote her now. She'd go, maybe, or maybe not, because here, in this clearing of machines and pine and steel warmed by her fire, Clara had already done what no panel, no paycheck, no recognition could ever match. She had endured the lie and lived to outwork it. The engine pulsed behind her like a heartbeat. The mule snorted in her sleep. Somewhere far off, an owl called once and was answered. Clara stood, set her mug down, and spoke aloud to no one but the night. They said the creek was too deep. She turned toward the shed, toward the glow she built. But I crossed it anyway. And then, without drama, without pause, without looking back, Clara James stepped into the room that bore her name, the room that ran because she had refused to leave, the story that no longer needed to be told because it had already been lived. By dawn, the frost had returned. A thin silver layer brushed the rooftops, gathering on the window panes and the tools left out overnight. Clara moved through it like someone used to winter, boots crunching with purpose, hands bare despite the chill. She opened the engine shed just as the first golden light hit the ridge, her fingers brushing the carved plaque as she passed beneath it. She crossed the creek. Then she made it run. It still made her pause, not because of the words, but because they hadn't been hers. They belonged to the men who had once doubted her, to the girls who had followed her, to the legacy of every fix she'd made without applause, and yet somehow the plaque said exactly what it needed to. Inside, the gauges held steady. The logs were clean. The machines, hers, woke with a soft, familiar rhythm. Tess arrived a moment later, hat pulled low, shoulders sharp with morning readiness. "Boiler's good. We're holding at 93%, she said. Clara nodded. "Then today we train." Tess grinned. "A new one?" Clara handed her a checklist. 2. Out in the yard, 2 wide-eyed apprentices waited beside the tool shed. One looked nervous, the other looked skeptical. Both straightened when Clara approached. She didn't greet them with small talk, just handed over the tools and said, "You're not here to be impressive. You're here to be exact." The nervous one blinked. "Yes, ma'am?" Clara turned toward the generator shed. "Follow me." And they did, like every worker before them had. By mid-morning, the sun had melted the frost. The camp was alive again with movement, heat, the buzz of progress. Clara watched from the high slope for a moment, arms folded, gaze sweeping across the cabins, the sheds, the path to the creek that had once been the edge of everything. Now it was just another piece of the ground she'd claimed. The mule stood near the tree line, tail flicking lazily, ears tuned to Clara's voice even from a distance. She didn't need to be tied anymore. She stayed because she knew where she belonged. Just like Clara. At dusk, the apprentices returned their tools. Tess nodded in approval. "They'll do." Clara didn't smile, but she stayed quiet long enough to mean it. Later, when the lanterns lit up the camp again, she wrote one more line in her logbook before turning in. "They said I wouldn't last the winter, but I taught them how to last through the next one." She capped her pen, closed the book, and as the lights across camp flickered steady in the dark, she exhaled the only kind of breath that matters. The kind you earn, the kind that stays, the kind that proves you crossed the creek, and never once looked back. By evening, the sky burned orange. The ridge caught the light first, then the tall pines, then the rooftops of silver pine one by one. Smoke curled from the chimneys, carrying the scent of wood and steel and something older. Memory. Clara stood in the open doorway of the engine shed, watching the day settle into itself. Her gloves hung on a nail, still damp from the morning frost, and the work was done. The pressure held. The bearings were clean. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was earned. Behind her, the apprentices finished sweeping the floors. One of them, the quiet one with ink stains on his knuckles, turned to her before leaving and asked, "How did you know it would work? The bypass you built last winter, the one they said wouldn't hold." Clara didn't turn. "I didn't know," she said, "but I knew what would fail if I didn't try." He nodded, slower than most would, and left without another word. She appreciated that. She stepped outside. The path down to the creek was well worn now, not muddy, not rutted, just known. The same path she'd once taken through suspicion, alone, dragging a wagon and a name that didn't yet mean safety. She followed it now with both hands in her coat pockets. At the water's edge the current ran smooth, shallow. It hadn't rained in weeks. The same boulders that had once broken the flow now sat like monuments. She remembered the night she crossed it, boots soaked, heart locked down, the weight of the lie pressing behind her like a second shadow. She stood still, not to dwell, to measure the distance. From there to here, from accused to known, from erased to engraved, from the girl they had doubted to the woman they followed. She picked up a small stone from the creek bank, ran her thumb across it, then tossed it lightly into the water. It skipped once, then sank without a sound. Behind her, the lights of the camp glowed warm through the trees, and the plaque above the engine shed door, her name, her truth, caught the last light of the day. Clara turned back toward it and whispered, "Still running," then walked home. By midnight, the camp had gone to sleep beneath a sky thick with stars. The air was cool, still edged with summer warmth, but hinting at the shift to come. A breeze stirred the pines, carried the scent of iron, pine pitch, and something softer. Roses, long wilted, but still remembered. Clara stood alone near the edge of the creek, arms wrapped across her chest, coat open, hair pulled back in a loose tie. The moonlight silvered the surface of the water, and the steady current whispered against the rocks like a story retold by someone who'd lived it enough times to know which parts mattered most. She hadn't meant to stay out this long. She hadn't meant to come down here at all, but she had felt the pull all evening. It wasn't the place itself, it was the weight of what had happened here, of who she had been the last time she stood at this very bend, boots soaked, fingers trembling, eyes locked on the other side with no promise anyone would be waiting to let her in. They hadn't. Not at first. They'd watched her arrive and made up their minds before she had spoken, accused, assumed, looked her in the eye and told her, without saying a word, that she was a mistake waiting to happen. And she had crossed anyway, not because she was certain, because she was right. Now the camp stood behind her, not as a place she had fought to be part of, but a place shaped by her presence. Not just the mechanics, not just the pressure systems and relays and fuel reserves, but the expectations, the culture, the quiet belief that you didn't have to raise your voice to be worth hearing, you just had to stay when it counted, long enough to prove you weren't the problem, long enough to make them ask the right question next time. She sat on a smooth boulder at the creek's edge, pulled out the folded letter she'd been carrying all day. It had come from another woman at another camp, one Clara had never met. The note was short, the ink shaky. They said I couldn't. I told them someone like me already had. Clara closed her eyes, folded the letter again, and tucked it into the pocket inside her coat, where she kept the things that mattered most, the quiet proofs, the names of women who hadn't been given the benefit of the doubt and showed up anyway. She leaned back slightly, stared up at the sky. When she was younger, she thought strength would feel like shouting, like being louder than the voices that tried to push her out. Now she knew better. Strength was staying still when everything else was running. It was silence that didn't shrink. It was knowing what was true and letting time do the rest. The generator back at camp rumbled low, steady as ever. The light in the engine shed was out, but she could picture every corner, every cable, every name in the logbook. Every time she'd signed her initials next to a repair that kept the lights on, the heat flowing, the work going. Clara James. Not just the one who crossed the creek, the one who made the crossing matter, who built something on the other side that was worth the weight it had taken to get there. She stood slowly, knees stiff, hands chilled. Before heading back up the trail, she looked over her shoulder one last time. "I came here with nothing but my name," she whispered, "and I leave it in every room that still stands." Then she turned and walked back toward the camp, still humming, with the rhythm of her refusal to be forgotten. By sunrise, Clara James had already walked the perimeter of the camp twice. It was the first day of the new quarter, and, like clockwork, the company auditors would be riding in by noon. They did it every 3 months now, ever since the sabotage incident, ever since the woman they'd once treated like a temporary inconvenience had proven herself to be the very reason Silver Pine still stood, the reason the lights stayed on, the reason the boilers ran clean, the reason not a single incident report had crossed the regional desk in over 180 days. They came now not to question her, but to learn from her. Clara hadn't changed her routine. She still woke before dawn, lit the stove herself, checked the gauges while the rest of the camp stirred in their bunks. Her boots were caked in dust by the time the kitchen bell rang for breakfast. The logbook sat open on her desk, clean and filled with precise, steady handwriting, each line a testament to systems built on resilience, not on repair. She walked through the machine shed slowly, hand trailing along the edges of the main housing, touching every bolt like a prayer. She didn't just maintain the camp, she communed with it. Every hiss of steam, every clank of chain, every low rumble in the pipes, it all spoke to her. And she had learned to listen so deeply that sometimes she could feel a failure hours before it happened. That kind of knowing didn't come from training manuals or blueprints. It came from staying, from being dismissed and showing up again anyway, from being blamed and staying silent until the work spoke louder than the lie. She'd long since stopped thinking of herself as the woman who had been accused. That version of Clara had burned away somewhere between the sabotage and the moment she rewired the generator line by hand, using parts she wasn't even supposed to have access to. What remained now was something stronger, rooted, untouchable. She passed Tess in the yard, clipboard in hand. "They'll want to see the expansion valves," Tess said, falling into step beside her. Clara nodded. "They'll ask about pressure reports. Don't let them skip past the bypass line. That's where the last camp went wrong." "Got it," Tess said. "And if they ask who signed off?" Clara gave her a look. "You did." Tess's eyes narrowed. "They'll ask why it wasn't you." "Then tell them I'm not in charge of everything," Clara said. "I just built the ground it stands on." By mid-morning, the auditors arrived, 2 men and 1 woman in crisp vests and polished boots, their eyes scanning everything like they'd already decided what the report would say. But Silver Pine didn't flinch. The crew moved with the calm of people who knew their work would hold. That was Clara's real legacy, not just machines that ran, but people who knew why they ran, people who asked better questions, who trusted women with wrenches and didn't wait for permission to listen when they spoke. The auditors toured the engine shed. One of the men pointed at the pressure board. "Who signed this design?" Clara didn't answer. Tess did. "I did." The woman auditor raised an eyebrow. "With whose oversight?" "Clara's," Tess said. "But she doesn't sign for me anymore." The woman nodded, said nothing else. "And Clara?" She leaned against the far wall, arms folded, not smug, just certain. She knew what came next. Later that day, the auditors left with their notes, their photos, their quiet conversations. Clara watched them ride off without a word. Behind her, the camp pulsed with life. The roses had started blooming again, early this year, pushing up along the fence line with a stubbornness she admired, sharp-edged and certain, red as fire, beautiful, but only because they'd survived the frost. She walked the edge of the creek again that night. not because she needed to remember what had happened, but because it reminded her who she'd been the moment she chose not to turn back. The water ran fast over flat rock, and the stars scattered across its surface like ash. She crouched by the bank, touched the cool edge with her fingers, and whispered to the dark, "I was never afraid of the current. I was afraid they'd never see me cross." But now they had. And across every shed, every switchboard, every rebuilt frame in this place, her name remained, not as a warning, as the foundation. She stood slowly, breath steady, and walked back to a camp that would outlive her, but never forget her. Because Clara James had not been saved. She had been right. She had stayed. And because of her, so had everyone else. By nightfall, the camp lay quiet again, cloaked in the low hum of cooling machinery and the occasional creak of timber beams settling under the night's breath. Lanterns still glowed behind thick glass, casting golden halos on the ground. The scent of sap and smoke drifted across the clearing. Somewhere a lone hammer tapped once, then stopped. Clara James stood at the edge of the porch, arms crossed over her chest, her shadow stretched long behind her. She had removed her gloves and set them neatly on the rail. The wood beneath her boots was smooth, worn by time, sun, and the pacing of a woman who had built a life, one bolt, a truth, one refusal at a time. She could still feel the river in her bones. Even now, all this time later, she remembered the moment her foot touched the water, how the current pulled and whispered, how the mud sucked at her heels like it wanted her to stay in place. How the wagon behind her had felt impossibly heavy. How the weight on her shoulders hadn't come from the tools but from the lie. The lie they had crafted, quick and sharp, to cover for someone else's mistake. It wasn't that they truly believed she had stolen anything. It was that she had walked into their world with too much certainty, and they had mistaken that for threat. She turned now, slowly, and looked toward the generator shed. Light seeped from the cracks around the door. Inside, the machine still pulsed with energy, clean, stable, steady. The same generator that had gone cold in the middle of that long-ago winter, the same one she'd brought back to life with oil-stained fingers and hands blistered from days of silence. They'd come to her afterward, quietly. First the foreman, then the others. Some offered apologies, most didn't. It hadn't mattered. She hadn't stayed for them. She'd stayed for the work, for the systems that needed rebuilding, for the women who came next, and they had come. Over the past year, new faces passed through the camp gates every month. Some stayed, most moved on. But they all came having heard the story, not the sanitized one in the company's annual report, but the real one, passed between bunk beds and over late-night tea. They said Clara James had been accused of theft, and instead of defending herself with words, she'd answered with work. They said she had crossed a creek in the middle of a storm with a wagon full of tools and no guarantee anyone on the other side would open the door. They said the only reason Silver Pine still stood was because she did. Clara exhaled, slow and long. From inside her cabin came the soft shuffle of paper. Tess finishing the daily logs, keeping the systems alive in their own way now. Clara didn't need to check the entries. She trusted the rhythm, trusted the hands. She descended the porch steps, her breath fogging in the cool air. She made one last walk through the yard, boots crunching over gravel, passing cabins and sheds and stories. She ran her hand along the side of the rose trellis, thorny and stubborn, but starting to leaf again. In the dark, she could still smell them, wild, red, sharp. At the far edge of the yard stood the post with her name carved into it. Not a statue, just a marker. Clara James. Cross the creek and never back down. No date, no title, just the truth. She touched the engraving with her fingertips, as if checking that it was still there. Then she turned toward the ridge, toward the trees she had once walked past with no map, no compass. Just fire and the certainty that her story was still worth telling, even if no one believed it yet. But now they did. Now they built by it. Clara James smiled, barely but fully, and whispered to the night, "I stayed." And the machines hummed their reply, because in a world that had once tried to silence her, Clara James had left behind something louder than any lie, a legacy that worked, held, and outlasted everything meant to stop her. By the time the moon reached its highest point in the sky, Clara James had finished her walk. The camp was asleep, deeply, peacefully. Not because there was nothing left to fear, but because the people within it had learned what safety meant when it was built, not given. She had taught them that, not in lessons or lectures, but in the way she held a wrench, in the way she walked into rooms where no one expected her to stay and stayed anyway, in the way she crossed that freezing creek with a wagon full of tools and a name they were ready to burn, and instead of drowning, she'd rebuilt the shore. Now her name was written into the grain of the timber, into the steel of the pipes, into the ink of every line in the logbook. She stepped back inside the engine shed. Everything was clean, quiet, exact. On the back wall hung a small board where Tess had started keeping chalked phrases, things Clara had said over the months, things that stayed. One line read, "I didn't come here to be trusted. I came here to be right." Another, scrawled smaller beneath it in Tess's handwriting, said, "She didn't wait for the fire to go out. She brought the fuel." Clara ran her hand across the edge of the board. She didn't need legacy. She needed things to work. And they did. The next day she'd be riding out to the Southern Ridge camp. There'd been another equipment failure, and they'd asked for her by name. Not the company. The women. The ones who'd heard the real story. Who knew what it meant when Clara showed up, gloves in hand, without needing to raise her voice? She sat down on the bench by the main switchboard and pulled out her notebook. Not the log, her own one, the private one. She opened to the first page and read what she'd written all those months ago. "They'll say I was difficult. They'll say I got in the way. But the light stayed on. And that's the part that matters." She smiled at that, then turned to the last page and wrote, "Silver Pine runs, not because I stayed to be accepted, but because I stayed long enough to prove they were wrong to doubt me. I wasn't their mistake. I was their turning point." She closed the book, set it back on the shelf, blew out the lantern, and stepped into the dark, boots echoing steady on the porch, the kind of sound that says, "I built this. I keep it. I leave it better than I found it." The camp didn't stir. It didn't need to. It ran. Because she did. By morning, the mist curled low over the ground like breath rising from the earth itself. The ridgeline glowed with the first stretch of sunlight, gold, slicing through pines and casting long, reaching shadows across Silver Pine's rooftops. Clara James was already awake. She sat on the steps of the engine shed with a mug of black coffee cupped between her hands, her boots laced tight, her coat already dusted with the day's work. Around her, the camp slowly woke, the creak of bunk doors, the scrape of shovels, the low voices of men who no longer second-guessed her presence. Not anymore. She didn't need to walk the yard every morning now. Tess had the checklist. The systems were solid. But Clara still liked to see the steam rise from the pipes herself, to hear the first hiss of pressure settling into its rhythm. It grounded her, reminded her of what she had built when everything else was coming undone. The mule, old and steady, stomped once in the paddock as if to say, "We're still here." Clara raised her mug in a silent toast. They were. Inside the shed, the wall bore a new message, chalked by someone during the night. Probably Tess. "Truth works better than noise. Ask Clara." She didn't erase it, didn't comment on it either. She just moved through the room, adjusting a tension coil on the backup line and checking the log. Everything held. By midday, the sky opened wide and blue, and the supply wagon rattled in from the south. The foreman stepped down with news from the lower camps. Equipment failing, a heat line bursting. "They asked for you," he said, handing her a letter. "By name." Clara read the note carefully, then folded it once. "I'll go," she said. The foreman cleared his throat. "Want me to send word to headquarters?" "No," she said. "Tell the women I'm coming. That's enough." She packed light. Just tools, her gloves, and the logbook. As she mounted the wagon and took the reins, Tess walked alongside. "You coming back?" Clara looked out at the trail ahead. The sun cut hard across it, shadowing the creek in the distance. "I never really left," she said. "I just carry the place with me." Tess smiled, but her eyes burned a little. "They'll listen, you know. Down there." Clara nodded. "They will." She clicked her tongue once. The mule stepped forward. As they rolled past the carved sign at the gate, Clara glanced up. Clara James' shed. She crossed the creek. Then she made it run. She tipped her hat to it once and kept going. The camp faded behind her. The trail opened wide. And the woman they once tried to silence carried her name forward, not as a wound, but as a map. By the time the sun began its slow descent behind the pines, Clara James had made it halfway to the southern ridge. The trail was rutted and dry, the mule plodding steady beneath the weight of her tools and provisions, the wagon creaking in rhythm with the breath of the trees. Wind whispered through the branches like it knew her name, like it had carried the story of the creek and the camp and the way she'd stayed, long after most would have turned around. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Silverpine ran without her now. That was the point. Her systems, her rhythm, her refusal to disappear, they had rooted deeper than any accusation. The camp she left behind would outlast any supervisor, any audit, any man too proud to admit a woman's hands had kept his lights on. But now it was someone else's camp that needed her. And when they sent word, they hadn't asked for a supervisor. They'd asked for Clara. By nightfall, she stopped to make camp beneath a bluff where the creek cut through stone. The water ran fast here, clearer than she'd seen in months, the moonlight gleaming silver across its back. She unhitched the mule, fed her by hand, and set her pack near the fire she built with practiced ease. Then she sat cross-legged on a flat rock, logbook in her lap, pencil in hand. She opened to the next blank page and wrote, "Day 1, Ridge South Line. Pressure faults reported. Sabotage suspected. Arrived prepared." She paused. Then below it added, "They still think the danger is the silence. But it's the woman who comes out of it with a wrench in her hand." Clara capped her pencil, leaned back against her pack. Overhead, the stars burned cold and bright. Somewhere ahead of her, another shed waited. Another broken system. Another crew who didn't know yet that when Clara crossed into a place, it didn't stay broken for long. And behind her, the name they had once tried to bury had bloomed into legend. Not because she chased power, but because she kept the fire lit long enough for others to find it. The mule huffed quietly, bedded down in straw. The fire cracked, slow and steady. And Clara James lay beneath the sky, eyes open, watching the dark shift above her, not afraid of it. Not anymore. Because she had crossed the creek, because she had stayed, because she knew, wherever the silence tried to settle next, she would already be on the way. By dawn, Clara James was already packing. The coals from last night's fire glowed low in the dirt, her coffee brewed hot and black over a new flame. She moved without hesitation, boots laced, logbook stowed, tools rechecked one by one with a quiet that had nothing to do with fatigue and everything to do with focus. The mule stood saddled before the sun had crested the bluff, ears flicking toward the forest, as if sensing what Clara already knew. This next camp was in trouble, and trouble didn't wait. She'd ridden enough broken trails by now to recognize the signs, the missing details in the request for help, the vague references to technical issues, the way they didn't mention who had been in charge when things went wrong. She knew the pattern, knew what it felt like to walk into a room after something failed and find people too proud to say the truth out loud. But she also knew how to walk in and make things right anyway. She hitched the mule, climbed onto the bench, and tapped the reins gently. As the wagon started to roll, the wheels thumped over roots and loose stone, and behind her the fire smoked itself out. She didn't look back. She never needed to anymore. The trees parted as the trail wound lower, into a valley that ran quiet and dense with pine. Birds stirred. The creek gurgled to her left, cutting through the landscape like memory. And just past the next bend, the first edge of the Southern Ridge camp came into view. Half a dozen buildings scattered in a loose semicircle, the generator shed crouched low near the edge of the hill. No smoke, no sound, no sign of working machinery. Clara narrowed her eyes. She pulled into the yard slow, dismounted, without ceremony, and stepped toward the shed with the calm, deliberate pace of someone who had crossed this threshold before. Two men stepped out from the office porch. One held a clipboard, the other a fuse in his hand, like it might burn him. "You Clara James?" the first one asked, as if he already knew. She nodded once. "Where's the failure?" "Main power's dead. Backup's locked out. No one can get the regulator to reset. We've been down 3 days." "And the engineer?" "Left. Claimed it wasn't his job to fix someone else's mess." Clara looked past them. "But it was yours to call me." The man flushed. "We didn't know who else to ask." "You did," she said. "You just waited too long." She didn't waste another word. She walked straight to the generator. Inside it smelled like panic, oil on old cloth, burned wires, cold metal. She crouched without asking, unlatched the access panel and ran her fingers along the fuse line. She found it in seconds, a jumper bypass installed backward like someone had tried to force the machine to comply, and blamed it when it failed. Classic. She repaired it without commentary. The room lit softly under the glow of the restored mainboard, the gauges rising slow but even. Outside, the lights came on one by one. She stood. The men waited at the door, jaws half open, eyes wide. "It's done?" one of them asked. "No," she said. "It started." They blinked. She stepped past them, unhitched her pack, pulled out her logbook. "You'll need to document everything from today forward. Clean, precise, no excuses." "But what should we—" "You'll write my name at the top of the page," she said, her voice steady as a line drawn in steel. "Then underneath, you'll write what broke, and then why it didn't stay that way." They didn't argue. They couldn't. Because the camp was running now, because she had arrived, because Clara James didn't just fix the power, she restored the truth. And by the time dusk fell over the trees again, her name, once erased, once doubted, once passed over, was the one they used when they needed everything to work. She crossed the yard alone that night. Lanterns flickered in the windows. The mule dozed by the gate. She leaned against the railing and looked up at the sky, then whispered like a quiet oath, "They asked for me too late, but I came anyway, and I made it run, still, again, always." By midnight, the ridge camp pulsed with life again. Steam hissed from newly repaired lines. Pressure valves ticked in their rhythm. Lanterns glowed in every window. The silence that had wrapped the place like a shroud just hours earlier had been broken, piece by Clara's hands. Not with drama, not with noise, just with the kind of certainty that couldn't be faked. She sat now at a rough-hewn table in the back of the maintenance shack, sleeves rolled to her elbows, grease still smudged along her jawline. Her tools were laid out beside her, cleaned and orderly, like soldiers returned from battle. A tin cup of black coffee sat cooling beside her logbook, open to a page half filled with her tight, even handwriting. Across from her sat one of the camp's newer hires, a wiry girl named Maureen with calloused fingers and eyes that had watched every move Clara made that day. "Can I ask you something?" Maureen said. Clara didn't look up. "You just did." The girl cracked the faintest smile. "Why didn't you leave back when they tried to blame you? You could have gone anywhere?" Clara paused, then looked up, gaze steady. "Because if I'd left," she said, "they would have kept telling the story their way." Maureen blinked. "You mean about the theft?" "No," Clara said. "About who gets to stay, about who gets trusted, about who's allowed to be right without apologizing for it." She closed the logbook, capped her pen, took a sip of the bitter coffee. "I stayed because someone had to show them what it looks like when a woman's competence doesn't flinch under pressure." Outside, someone was hammering a bracket back into place. Somewhere, a belt whirred. The camp didn't sleep yet. They were still catching up to the pace she'd restored. "You think they'll ever forget what happened?" Maureen asked. Clara smiled, just slightly. "No," she said, "because every time something runs right, they'll remember who fixed it." She stood, stretched her back, and walked toward the door. The moon hung high over the treetops now, silvering the rooftops, making the power lines gleam. She stepped out into the yard and breathed deep. Behind her, the shed glowed warm. Ahead of her, the trail out curled back into the forest, waiting. She'd go soon. Another camp would call. Another line would snap. Another silence would need breaking. But tonight Clara stayed. She walked the perimeter once, touching the pipes she'd patched, the junctions she'd replaced, the panels now humming like heartbeat. And as she passed beneath the last lamp, she said, softly to herself, "They tried to stop the current with a lie, but I made the system remember me anyway." And it did, with every hum, with every light, with every name spoken in reverence after a repair done right. Clara James had not come for forgiveness. She had come for function. And when she walked on from this camp in the morning, she would leave it like she left every place, running, rooted, and written in her name. By dawn, dew clung to every surface, thin, glinting, gone the moment the sun touched it. Clara James stood alone in the yard, her boots damp, her breath steady. The Ridge camp was quiet, but not dead. It was the kind of quiet born after order returns, after chaos has been shouldered and resolved. The generator hummed low from the back shed, its rhythm smooth again. The heat lines had held through the night. No alarms, no flickers, no sabotage. Everything ran, because Clara had been here. She crossed to the pump house and rested her palm on the side of the steel casing warm beneath her hand. Then she stepped back, checked the pressure dial once more, and signed her name at the bottom of the final page of the maintenance log. C. James. System stabilized. Origin error corrected. Staff retrained. Status reliable. She shut the book. When she turned, the foreman was waiting. He looked tired, but not defensive anymore. "They say you don't leave a place the same," he said. Clara arched a brow. "Wouldn't be much point in coming, would there?" He gave a slow nod. "You heading out today?" Clara looked toward the forest road, the one that twisted north toward Silver Pine, back to her shed, her mule, the young one she was still teaching to hold a line steady in the face of silence. "I am." The foreman hesitated. "Do you need anything?" She shook her head. "I've got everything I need." She saddled the mule herself, like always. She packed the wagon light. The broken parts she'd taken out of the system had been melted down, scrapped, reworked into brackets and bolts. Nothing wasted. That was her rule. Before she left, Maureen ran out from the bunkhouse, a satchel slung over one shoulder. "I wrote it all down," she said. "Everything you did, every reason why." Clara met her eyes. "Then you're already one step ahead of the next man who says it can't be done." Maureen swallowed. "You think I'll be believed?" "No," Clara said. "Not at first." She pulled on her gloves, climbed into the wagon seat, and added, "But they'll believe the lights when they stay on. They'll believe the heat. They'll believe the systems that don't fail. And they'll learn that you're the reason." The mule snorted. The wagon creaked forward. Clara didn't look back. She didn't need to, because behind her another camp stood running. Another silence had cracked and given way to respect. Another girl had picked up the truth and started writing it down. And ahead of her, the next trail, the next busted line, the next lie to outlast with her name, her hands, and her refusal to be erased. Clara James crossed the ridge at first light and carried with her the hum of every place. That ran because she stayed. By mid-morning, the trees opened up, and the old road leveled into soft earth lined with pine needles and early autumn dust. The air smelled like dried cedar and something quieter, something settled. Clara James pulled the mule to a slow stop beneath a ridge she'd crossed 3 times before, though never like this. Not after Silverpine, not after the ridge camp, not after they'd stopped asking if she was the one to call and started asking when she could arrive. The mule twitched an ear but didn't protest. They both knew the rhythm by now. Clara climbed down, stretched her back, and pulled out the small canteen strapped beneath the wagon bench. Her gloves were off, her sleeves rolled. Sweat glistened faint on her neck, but her breath was easy. Every part of her had grown into this life, this trail, this weight, this work. She reached into her coat and pulled out her logbook. It was almost full. Every camp, every system, every lie she'd turned over with calloused hands and corrected with truth. Each page more exact than the last, some written by her, some by the women she'd trained, women who, like her, had been handed silence and asked to swallow it, and who, like her, had refused. She flipped to the last entry from the ridge camp. The ink had smudged slightly in one corner. She ran her thumb across it, then turned to a blank page and wrote, Camp 3 complete. System integrity restored. New lead, Maureen. Shows precision. Asks smart questions. Learns faster than they expect. Rebuilt confidence is louder than any rumor. They will remember her not because she demanded space, but because she never gave it back. She closed the book, slid it into her satchel, and looked out over the trail ahead. Another 2 days, and she'd reach the next one. They'd written to her in haste, said the systems were old, said no one had updated the pressure lines in years, said they weren't sure if she was available, but if she was, they'd clear whatever they had to. She hadn't answered yet. She didn't need to. Clara would show up when she was ready. That was the difference now. She didn't beg for space. She chose where to stand. She'd earned the right to arrive on her own terms, with her own name, with no apologies folded into the hem of her work shirt. She leaned against the wagon for a moment, looking up at the sky. A hawk circled overhead, slow, unbothered. Then she whispered, not loud, but with the full certainty of a woman who had outlasted everything thrown at her. I was never a warning. I was always the answer. Then she climbed back up into the seat, flicked the reins, and carried on. Because there was more to fix, more to build, more women watching, and more stories to rewrite. With truth, with steel, and with the name Clara James signed at the bottom of every system. That still ran. By dusk, the light stretched long and golden across the trail. The wagon creaked beneath Clara's weight as she leaned forward, guiding the mule gently around a bend where the earth had softened from last week's rains. The trees rose taller here, older, unchanged by logging crews, untouched by machinery. Clara let the silence linger. It wasn't empty. It was full of everything she'd carried. The heat of the boiler at Silverpine, the hiss of the pipes in the ridge camp, the silence before a man cleared his throat and finally said, "We were wrong." She didn't replay those moments to feel pride. She replayed them to remember. Nothing that runs smoothly was born that way. It took work, not the loud kind, not the easy kind, the kind that wore you down until all that was left was the truth and the hands that kept holding. She pulled the mule to a stop on a flat patch of grass just beyond the trees, unlatched the harness, patted her companion's neck. The mule, as always, didn't say much, but she stayed. Clara lit a small fire, just enough for warmth, just enough to steep the coffee she liked strong and bitter. She sat with her knees pulled up, her logbook open across her thighs. Stars blinked overhead. Far in the distance, the wind stirred the pine. She flipped back to the first pages, the ones that held her beginning. Accused, ignored, doubted. But nowhere on those pages had she written the word quit. And now, the back pages were filling with names of others who were watching, learning, stepping up. Tess has started teaching. Maureen rebuilt a line without waiting for permission. New girl in North Bend signed her work with pride. Clara smiled, then wrote, Camp 4 on the horizon. No map yet, no invitation, just a story passed north about a woman who made the whole system remember her. That's enough. She paused, then added, They don't need to know who I am when I arrive. They'll know by the time I leave. The fire cracked softly. The mule sighed, stretching out in the grass. And Clara leaned back on her elbows, eyes on the sky, letting the night settle around her like a truth too old to argue with. I don't lead with my name, she whispered. I lead with what holds. And as the dark folded in, Clara James stayed exactly where she was, a woman in motion, a system that worked, and a story that could no longer be rewritten without her.